welcome to the special edition of IBFD's Tax Takes News and Views, reporting on the just approved plan to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. I'm Ms. Medenijs, Tax Technical Coordinator at IBFD, and with me for Beyond the News interviews is Stuart Gibson, IBFD's Chief Editor Global News in Washington, D.C. Exactly 1 month after the leaders of the G7 nations reached agreement on a global minimum tax, the OECD announced that 132 members of the BEPS inclusive framework had reached a historic agreement on a two-pillar solution to tackle the tax challenges arising from digitalization. And just last weekend, the G20 finance ministers announced their agreement. To honor this extraordinary moment in international taxation, today's show is a one-off summer holiday special dedicated to the results of 8 years of negotiations over international tax reform in the digital age. To kick us off, I will take you quickly through the highlights of the agreement and summarize the first public reactions. Then, Stuart Gibson will host a two-part interview with international tax leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. First, he will get a US perspective on the agreement from Bob Stack, former lead BEPS negotiator for the US under the Obama administration and now Managing Director International Tax in the Washington National Tax Practice at Deloitte. Then, Stuart will get a European perspective from Giorgia Maffini, who is Special Advisor on Tax Policy and Transfer Pricing with PricewaterhouseCoopers UK and former Deputy Head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD. But first, we turn to the highlights of the OECD's global agreement on Pillar 1 and 2 as reported in IBFD's Tax News Service. Two pillars, two scopes. It's one of the most significant outcomes of the global tax reform negotiations. Pillar 1, which reallocates some taxing rights over so-called residual profits to market jurisdictions, comes into play for multinationals with annual revenues exceeding 20 billion euros and profitability above 10%. Good news for the extractive and financial services industries, as they are excluded from the scope of Pillar 1. Pillar 2 would impose a global minimum tax on a much broader scale, targeting companies with annual turnover exceeding 750 million euros and following the same scope of country-by-country reporting of BEPS Action 13. Unlike Pillar 1, however, the extractive and financial services industries are not exempt from the global minimum tax. But government entities, international organizations, non-profits, and pension and investment funds that are ultimate parent entities won't be subject to the global rules. Looking at the new Nexus rules for Pillar 1, market jurisdictions will generally fall within the scope for Amount A when a covered multinational generates at least 1 million euros in revenue within their jurisdiction. A separate rule will apply for jurisdictions with GDP less than 40 billion. They can assert taxing rights over companies that generate 250,000 euros in annual revenue within their jurisdiction. When it comes down to satisfying the needs of multinational enterprises, the agreement provides for improved legal certainty with the creation of mandatory binding dispute prevention and regulation mechanisms designed to avoid double taxation over Amount A. And speaking of satisfying, good news for the US, as the agreement calls for nations to roll back their digital services taxes. What comes perhaps as a surprise is that the agreement considers the GLOBE rules, also the global minimum taxation rules, as a common approach rather than a minimum standard. This means that while the countries in the inclusive framework are not obliged to implement the GLOBE rules, they must accept the result when other countries elect to apply them. Although the OECD statement specifies many required elements of the deal, much remains to be negotiated, with the goal to reach final agreement by this October. Along with developing a dispute resolution mechanism, the OECD aims to streamline and simplify Amount B with a particular focus on the needs of low-capacity countries, which it expects to finalize by the end of 2022. The OECD expects that the proposed MLI for Amount A, however, will have been developed and open for signature in 2022, aiming for it to take effect in 2023. With only 7 nations of the 139 in the BEPS inclusive framework declining to sign on the agreement, the first responses have been mostly positive. The African Tax Administration Forum, however, stated that they would rather see a global minimum tax rate of 20% instead of the agreed 15%. Nations with low corporate tax rates, notably Ireland, Hungary, and Estonia, have raised objections to Pillar 2. In addition, the EU has been put on the defensive with its plans to adopt a digital levy, in apparent defiance of the agreement. European Commission Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager defended the EU's plan, claiming that it's not so much a tax as a levy. But just this week, the EU decided to push back its timetable for adopting its digital levy, presumably in response to criticism from the United States. It remains to be seen whether that delay will be temporary or permanent. And speaking of responses and possible implications, it's time to go beyond the news for Stuart Gibson's interview with Bob Stack and Giorgia Maffini. Stuart?
Thank you, Esme, for that informative summary of the agreement announced last weekend by the G20 finance ministers. I'm Stuart Gibson, Chief Editor of Global News here at IBFD, bringing you two perspectives on the agreement. I'm joined first today by Bob Stack, Managing Director, International Tax in the Washington National Tax Practice at Deloitte, and former lead negotiator on the BEPS project under the Obama administration. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, nice to be here, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
So great you could be available for this. So, Bob, when we talked last November, we were looking at how an incoming Biden administration could possibly get up to speed and fully participate in the OECD's work on the tax challenges arising from digitalization. Here we are 6 months in, and the U.S. has not only joined, but in an important sense has led nearly all the members of the inclusive framework to develop a plan to tackle those challenges. Were you surprised the U.S. and so many members got here so quickly?
Yeah, I sure was surprised, Stuart. And I think what I think was the cause of the surprise was that the catalyst for this, of course, was domestic U.S. politics. The Biden administration wants to raise the GILTI rate, and they realized that if they couldn't go to Congress and say, "Don't worry, Congress, the rest of the world is going to come along with a min tax," then companies would go to Congress and say that they were being put at a competitive disadvantage. Then they realized, well, they came up with a way to simplify Pillar 1 that also satisfied the rest of the world. So they made enormous progress. But we can't forget that if the Democrats had won the 2 seats in Georgia, which surprised everybody in December, then, maybe they wouldn't have gotten that impetus because the world wouldn't be sure that the Biden folks could really deliver on even their domestic agenda. So lots of surprises, enormous accomplishment for the administration.
And I couldn't agree more. I mean, and how often do you see major gains in international tax policy determined by razor-thin Democratic majorities in the U.S. Congress and domestic politics? I think it's a very noteworthy observation. So from what you've seen of the plan, what do you think are the most significant benefits for the U.S. and U.S.-based businesses?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is tough to generalize about. If you're a company that's subject to DSTs and the deal is fully implemented, meaning the DSTs withdrawn, you get a reprieve for the DSTs and you get a bunch of certainty around your amount A, and the U.S. has pushed for certainty on related issues like PE and transfer pricing. Now, the DSTs themselves are expanding in scope around the world. So what is the pool of companies that are really saying, we want this benefit from relief from DSTs? From the U.S. government perspective, Secretary Yellen told Senator Crapo in a letter, look, this is going to be largely revenue neutral. And I think people are going to ask to kick the tires on that. But again, the U.S. gets Pillar 2 and gets some more, certainty in the world. So I think that's the lens through which this is being viewed by the government and companies. It doesn't mean there won't be some dissent, but that would be on, the potential plus side.
So because you have pillars 1 and 2 working in tandem, the U.S. would give up some potential revenue on pillar 1, although that's not certain because if companies are locating IP and other assets in jurisdictions outside the U.S. wouldn't be taxing that anyway. But there's a major gain on pillar 2 because it basically, the hope is that it stops the race to the bottom. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, on the pillar one, if other countries would be taxing it, there is this issue of, well, we may give a foreign tax credit for it. So that's all up to the math that people have to do to go through to say, are we going to be winners and losers just fiscally? And is that something Congress is going to, expect or demand as the price for pushing this forward? That remains to be seen.
So, well, what do you see as the most problematic parts of the plan from a U.S. perspective?
Well, I think the 800-pound gorilla is Congress going to go for this? I think is the problematic. And will we come up with something that says we yes, we'll do this because we're going to get the removal of DSTs. And so I think that people are going to be watching that. We've already seen some letters that are kind of floating around out there about Senator Crapo and House Republican ranking chairman Brady put a letter out saying that they had questions about elements of the plan. There's already been reports that a large plurality of the companies in scope are U.S. companies, and how will that play out politically? The other problem that hasn't getting as talked about, though, is the incredible complexity of these rules, both pillar one and two. There's not that many of us who have to spend our time in the weeds on these things, but these things are really complicated. Let me just give you an example. Pillar one aims to give more income to market countries. Well, now consider the case of a chip manufacturer that sells a chip to a component manufacturer, which in turn puts that component in a product that's sold through a distribution network. So, what's the market? And who gets the profit from it? And if you can't figure that out, and if you can't make it administrable for companies and tax authorities, like, have we really achieved anything? So I'm a little, my hat goes off to the people having to do all this technical work, but it is extraordinarily hard. And let's not forget that's an obstacle to getting this across the finish line as well.
No, I agree. And obviously, there are going to be scenarios that are going to make it hard to apply the general principles. And so they're going to have to come up with ways to do that, especially since one of the big benefits seems to be greater tax certainty. And of course, if it's so complex you can't get the certainty, then you seem to have created a circular situation where you're giving up something and not getting anything in return.
Yep.
So there's still 8 members of the inclusive framework that have not signed on, and at least 3 of them, Estonia, Ireland, and Hungary, have corporate tax rates below the minimum global rate announced on Pillar 2. How significant is that opposition, and could that potentially scuttle the plan to set the global minimum tax rate at least 15%?
The short answer is we really don't know yet. A lot of this will play out in the EU, which wants to do a minimum tax through a directive, and they need unanimity there for the tax rules to apply. Having said that, the fact that some of the countries in the EU have not yet signed on or may not sign on to the IF leaves them a little room for leverage in the EU, but it's way too early in the game to predict that, for example, those 3 countries will veto any directive in the EU. We just have to wait and see how this plays.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the EU, because the next question I was going to ask is what are the major sticking points? Because there's a lot of technical work, as you pointed out. And it seems to me one of the sticking points is that the EU still wants to impose a digital levy that they're trying to sell as, no, it's not really a DST, it's a digital levy. Is that a semantic issue, or is that a potential roadblock?
Well, just this morning, the press reports are that the EU is taking this under advisement and may be kicking its deadline. It first was going to be July 14th, then they were kicking it back a week, and we're now hearing they may not come out with their levy till October, kind of waiting for the Pillar 2. So the EU is clearly listening to the US complaints. Look, the fundamental problem that people are having is, well, what is a unilateral measure? And what defines a digital service tax that crosses the line? And until you come up with those principles, it's fair that some countries and places like EU are going to say, well, we're doing this, we don't think it's a problem, but we haven't defined the core principles yet to know whether that is. And that's, of course, a subject of agreement in and of itself.
Well, I agree with you on that. And on that same point, you have so many countries around the world, particularly in Latin America, that are imposing VAT on remote provision of digital services to their countries. And I assume that those are out of scope of this. Those are not considered DSTs.
No, VAT, value added taxes, were always in their own channel. And in fact, when I was co-chair of the digital task force back in BEPS 1, we had a whole bunch of good work on how you do VATs for digital goods and services. And that work has been taken up around the world and is unobjectionable. Now, you have to be a real expert to know the difference between a VAT that is not a problem and some of these DSTs. And that's another whole work stream that people have to engage in.
So more work to do between now and October. And I have to tell you, I was a skeptic about reaching an agreement according to the deadline that was set by the French 6 months ago. But stranger things have happened apparently. So I want to come back to a very popular game show in the U.S., Deal or No Deal. Howie Mandel used to ask all the contestants, deal or no deal. So at the end of the day, deal or no deal, and why or why not?
Well, actually, I think, it's fair to say that there is kind of a deal already. There's important things like, is it going to be 20 or 30% of the excess for Pillar 1? Is the rate going to be at least 15 or 15? So I don't want to minimize the amount of work to be done. But I think that the way it's been viewed by the press and by finance ministers around the world, it feels like, there's some kind of a deal. And then all eyes turn to the timing of the substance and implementation, these little things to be wrinkled out. Can they derail it? And of course, the strong focus on reaction of the US Congress, where all eyes are going to be, will the US ever do Pillar 1? Because if not, the whole thing can unravel.
And I think that those are the milestones, the mile markers to watch in the coming months as to whether there will be a deal. But you're optimistic that we will have a deal, and I suspect that those views are shared by many people, absent possibly some members of the U.S. Congress.
Well,
As you
actually,
point out.
the point I'm trying to make is there's one thing to say we have a deal. It's another thing to say the deal actually gets implemented, in a timely manner, and there's a lot of coordination to be done here. So I'm not so sure I'm on the optimistic side on implementation yet, but the world does seemingly have come together on a deal. The implementation stuff is really hard.
I think that's a fair point, and it's funny because we've seen that in other of the BEPS action items where there was a question about whether it could be implemented. And to me, the most successful example of that is the multilateral instrument, where it appears that has gained traction around the world. Now, it took quite a while, but if you're playing a long game on this, then it does look like we could get implementation over a period of time as it gains traction around the world. That's my takeaway from what you said. I think I got that right.
Yep.
So our guest today has been Bob Stack, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Treasury Secretary for International Tax Affairs, and now managing partner at Deloitte in Washington. I just want to thank you so much, Bob, for your time and your insights. This is a rapidly developing and very important subject, and I know our viewers appreciate your unique perspective.
Great. Thanks for having me, Stuart, and have a great day.
You too. And next, please stay tuned for my interview with Giorgia Maffini for a perspective from Europe. Next, I'm joined today by Dr. Giorgia Maffini, Special Advisor on Tax Policy and Transfer Pricing with PwC in London, and former Deputy Head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD, who actually worked on Pillar 2, the Global Minimum Tax. Welcome, Giorgia.
Thank you, Stuart. Always very nice to be here and talk to you.
Well, you're following on the heels of the interview that I did with Bob Stack, and I want to get your perspective as you sit there in Europe on some of the same questions I discussed with Bob. So here we are 6 months into the Biden administration, and the U.S. has not only joined, but has in an important sense played a strong leadership role in bringing nearly all the members of the BEPS inclusive framework to consensus on a plan to tackle the challenges posed by digitalization of the economy. Were you surprised that the U.S. and so many members got here so quickly?
Stuart, I think I am going to surprise you in saying that I was not surprised. And I think there are two reasons. The first one is that we knew that the countries that have traditionally being, driving the reform at the OECD, saying more or less the G7, had a plan. It wasn't a finalized plan, but it was a plan where to could work on. Of course, on our side of the Atlantic, there were some differences, but there was no willingness really from these countries to allow these differences to kill the project, essentially. The second reason is that the officials of some, at least of the officials of the new US administration, were very much on top of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 discussion well before being appointed in their roles. So from the point of view of the technical content of the project, they actually didn't need time to get up to speed. And I think something that it goes a little bit underestimated is the fact that, again, some of those who are working with the US administration know Europe very well. They know what unites Europe. They know what divides Europe. And I think this is crucial to quickly become a trusted partner in the work. Having said this, we can't say that getting to an agreement at the inclusive framework and then at the G20 this weekend was an easy thing to achieve. And I think when I see that countries like China, for example, are on board now, this is really an exceptional time in history, I think. And when you see this, you think it must have been quite difficult to get to the agreement.
So, Giorgia, from what you've seen of the plan, and leaving Brexit aside, what do you think are the most significant benefits for the nations of Europe, and particularly for European-based businesses?
I think, Stuart, that it's, without the final details of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, it's clearly a bit difficult to understand what the benefits are. But if we start from businesses, we have heard that the OECD is working on the tax certainty part of the project. And the tax certainty is about the mechanisms, essentially, for preventing and solving disputes, is about also Amount A. Amount A, if pitched at the right level, could have the potential to solve quite a few disputes in the market. So we have heard that the OECD is working on this, that this system for tax certainty will have mandatory and binding nature. So excellent news. We have heard that it will go beyond Amount A to also include transfer pricing disputes that are related to Amount A. This is excellent news, but the reality is that we don't know, we don't understand yet what these mechanisms are going to be concretely. So I think that for the work on tax certainty to be good news for business, it has to be effective. It has to be to deliver really more certainty. So it's good news, but we need to see whether that will be implemented effectively. And, the work of the policymaker is very difficult because you always have to strike a balance between raising revenues and not depressing essentially the incentive to invest. Without a result on tax certainty, we would be very clearly only on one side of the trade-off. We would just be raising revenues, essentially.
So my takeaway from that is that one huge benefit is tax certainty, but it's uncertain how tax certainty is going to look.
Absolutely. It's a great description of where we are at the moment, I think. I think there is good news for a group of taxpayers. So if we assume that countries will fully repeal DSTs when Pillar 1 is implemented, for a group of taxpayers that are not in the scope of Pillar 1, but are currently in the scope of many of the DSTs around the world, there could be, of course, a significant improvement in the environment, I think. If we then move to countries, I think we could look at two different levels. We could look at a very high level that goes beyond tax, and I think that there, in the current international environment, European countries, including the UK and the US, clearly want to show that multilateral cooperation is possible and that multilateral cooperation delivers, is able to solve important problems. So in this context, the question is how many projects are there that can deliver that can live up to this ambition? And the answer is unfortunately not many, probably a handful. So in this way, I think this project needs to succeed beyond its technical qualities. So it's very important for some of the countries. If that succeeds, it's something that few countries around the world will appreciate. If we then move to the tax level, from the perspective of how much Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, of how much revenue Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will raise, I think that there are a bit more of open questions. Pillar 1, we understood that it won't raise much revenues. Pillar 2 will raise revenues probably, but the question is for whom? And we think that in a dynamic setting where lower tax jurisdictions react to Pillar 2 by increasing their own effective tax rate, probably the largest part of the increasing revenues will accrue to this lower, probably smaller tax jurisdiction. It's true, though, that of course, if there is a floor, say 15%, assuming that we are going to be there in October, larger, higher tax countries could sustain, at least in the short run, slightly higher headline corporate tax rates. But I think that it's important to note that in a dynamic setting, we might well assume that the largest part of revenues will accrue to smaller, lower tax jurisdictions, I think.
So that's a good summary. And so you've got benefits, international benefits accruing beyond the tax world. And then you've got some benefits accruing to countries that have low tax rates now, smaller countries. So what do you see as the most problematic parts of the plan from a European perspective? Oh, wait a second. I did want to follow up on one thing. One major beneficiary is the financial services industry, isn't it? Because they're carved out of Pillar 1, right?
Well, so it's not clear what part of the financial services will be carved out. Maybe more traditional activities like banking, insurance, asset management, but there is definitely a question mark around fintechs or other parts of the financial sector that do not have the same regulation as, for example, the banking industry. So it might be that if under Pillar 1, the exemption is not as wide as we read in the press, for example.
I know that was a big issue for the United Kingdom in terms of London as a financial center.
That's right, Stuart. And I think I don't remember the numbers at the moment, but the financial sector for the UK remains one of the sectors that contributes a lot to the value added in
Right.
the UK.
So let me go back to the question that I went to too soon. So what are the most problematic parts of the plan, other than the fact that we don't know all of the details?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we shouldn't delve on the details because we don't know them very well yet, but maybe we could focus on something that has been forgotten a little bit on this side of the Atlantic. So generally in Europe, the environment is a higher tax environment for business, but also for individuals than in other jurisdictions. And at the same time, the European environment, including in the UK, is a bit less innovative than, for example, in the US. And growth has been not as fast before the pandemic as, for example, in the US. So, just to give you some figures, what we call the tax burden, so total tax over GDP in Europe on average is about 40%. In the US is around 25%. These are 2018 data from the European Commission. So you see the difference is quite large. So, in this environment, in this higher tax environment, I think that systems like Pillar 2 could be a bit more detrimental for Europe. And for example, with Pillar 2, you not only increase the burden of some multinationals, but under Pillar 2, governments have clearly less room to stimulate the economy, to stimulate investment, innovation through the tax system. You can still do that, maybe with non-tax measures, with grants, but in Europe, we also have strict state aid rules, which could be an impediment. So Pillar 2 ties government hands a little bit in terms of being able to stimulate the economy.
So that leads very nicely into the next question, which is, as you know, there's 7 countries that didn't sign on, including 3 in the European Union, Hungary, Ireland, and Estonia, and they have traditionally lower tax rates. Now, you and I both heard Grace Perez-Navarro this morning tell us that, well, it's not as bad as it may seem at first blush, because each of those countries plans to remain engaged because they have an interest in seeing a solution that, if it's going to apply to them, really takes their interests into account. So how serious is the opposition in your view, and do you think it'll scuttle the plan?
On the significance of the opposition, clearly the opposition comes from what we were saying before. You know, some governments, because of their specific context, prefer to be freer, to use tax policy to stimulate the economy, to stimulate investment. And in terms of the significance of the opposition, it is of course difficult to say, but if in fairness we look back at history, for example, Ireland has always proactively signed up to quite a lot of the BEPS actions, for example. So we might think that the same will happen, you know, at the end of the process for Ireland for Pillar 2. And I think there is an expectation on this side of the Atlantic that these countries will finally get on board, but frankly, we don't know yet. It's clearly difficult to say. We should say that had the proposed minimum tax rate been 12.5, of course,
that would have been a no-brainer.
Exactly, there would be clearly less opposition, and I think for Europe things would have been easier. So the insistence on a rate of at least 15% has created difficulties in Europe, I think. In terms of scuttling the plan, so if we look at the process in Europe, and in particular within the EU 27, so within the European Union, we know that a European directive on Pillar 2 would need unanimity, unless, of course, you know, you want to go down the road of enhanced cooperation, but that has not been tested. So I'm not sure that there is much support for that option. So with 3 countries out, you would struggle to pass a directive, okay? Passing a directive remains the preferred method. Having said this, in theory, within the European Union, you don't need an implementation via directive because countries can implement Pillar 2 through domestic legislation. But without a directive, the European Court of Justice could be really more willing to regard some elements of Pillar 2 as incompatible with a very important, you know, treaty on the functioning of the European Union. So in terms of process, the opposition of these 3 countries does create quite a few problems, really. And then you probably have heard a lot of discussion around the fact that Pillar 2, or because of how it is designed, and in fact, because of the under-tax payment rule, doesn't need everyone on board.
Right.
And I think that's true, but to a certain extent. So if many countries, if many small low-tax jurisdictions decide not to implement Pillar 2, we might be in a situation where the spirit of Pillar 2 cannot be applied, to be honest. So I think I would not be as optimistic as some of the comments we have seen in the press on the fact that Pillar 2 is waterproof. I don't think it is. But again, we need to see the final details.
So I want to pick up on Europe, and I know we're getting a little short on time here. So I want to come back to something because you were talking about the European Union, and you know that they had planned earlier this year, was supposed to be released, I think, this week, the initial plan to impose a digital levy across the entire 27 countries, member states. I know that there was some pushback from the U.S. Mr. Stacher yesterday said, oh no, we're going to hold off on that. Let's see how things play out. We'll revisit it in October. Where do you think that ends up?
It's difficult, Stuart. I won't put predictions on record, but maybe I'll just do a couple of observations. The first one is clearly the European move to say, we'll delay until October has come after very high level meetings between the Commission and the US administration. And this tells me, I think, that there is a constructive working relationship between Commission, European countries, and the US administration. This would have been very difficult only 10 months ago. It would have been a very difficult meeting.
Yes.
Then if we look at how a EU digital levy could be designed, we don't know, but it seems that the design of the EU digital levy resembles the current DST. So for this reason, clearly there is an issue of compatibility of the European digital levy with Pillar 1, of course. Having said that, if the digital levy turns out to also affect a lot of European multinationals, a lot of other non-US multinationals, really we need to ask on what basis will the US have the power to ask the Europeans to refrain from implementing a revenue raising measure when they need revenues. And I think this is a difficult point, and I'm not sure the US administration wants to become the tax police of the world and say no to more than what they really need to say no to.
I think that's a good point, because the motivation behind the EU digital levy had always been to raise revenue, not to tax remote businesses that have not been, at least in the Europeans' minds, fully taxed for their business activities in Europe. So it may very well be that this is a meaningful distinction that can be worked out as part of a final agreement in the fall. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sure. Yes, but the design is probably going to be the same as a DST from the technical point of view. But politically, it might be something difficult to stop. We'll see. Hopefully, we don't see it. But
well, there are a lot of moving parts here. You've got the DSTs, you've got the tax certainty under Pillar 1, you've got whatever the rate's going to be, and we haven't talked about the African Tax Administrators Forum argument that the minimum rate should be 20%. So there are a lot of moving parts. If you had to pick one, which was the biggest sticking point that had to be resolved, what would that be?
I think on Pillar 1, I would say I would go back to the tax certainty piece. That is very important, because otherwise, this project is just about raising revenues. And, the larger the reallocation under Amount A to markets, the more important will be the piece on tax certainty, really. So I think very, very important to strike the right balance again between raising revenues and not depressing the economy.
And interesting, I think that's an excellent observation, because not only does that address a lot of issues under Pillar 1, but tax certainty addresses issues under the other BEPS action items that we haven't even talked about. Because that had always been a sticking point, especially in some nations, some of the nations that are going to actually benefit from Pillar 1. So that trade-off is absolutely key, and I agree. It is important to get those details ironed out. Boy, I wish we had more time to talk, Giorgia. Your insights are just so valuable here. Our guest has been Giorgia Maffini, Special Advisor on Tax Policy and Transfer Pricing with PwC in London. I can't thank you enough for your time and for your insightful comments today, Giorgia.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Always great to speak to you.
That wraps up this special edition of Tax Takes News and Views from Esme Denise and myself. Thank you for watching. Here's hoping your summer is not too taxing.